What I want to talk about today is what I have called the MMT as currency killer hypothesis. Currency markets are driven by financial flows. Financial investors seek higher rates of return. The idea that MMT and a job guarantee would cause a currency to collapse, it might cause it to go up. Unemployment's low, presumably GDP growth is high. There's no clear indication that as soon as we adopt these policies, then the currency will collapse. In fact, it might do the opposite if these policies do what we know they will do.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. A big thank you to all of our supporters so far. At the beginning there, you heard author and economist Professor John T Harvey. And in a moment, we'll hear highlights of his presentation on what determines currency prices and what these insights mean for progressive policies such as the MMT Job Guarantee at this year's Levy Economics Institute Summer Seminar. Our huge thanks to the Levy Institute for their kind permission to produce the audio, and I've linked to where you can see video of the whole presentation in our show notes. If you're new to MMT, you can listen to our first 3 episodes for an introduction, but if you want to dive in here, the jumping off point is that governments spend money into existence when they spend, and you can listen to our various episodes on monetary operations for more, but that's just a statement of fact rather than a recommendation that governments should just spend anything they want on anything they want. That's certainly not my recommendation. Personally, just hypothetically, for instance, I'd hate to see a nation wasting fortunes on displays of opulence, exalting and erasing the colonial history of unelected heads of state and their families. That's just me. I'm sure you've got your own ideas too. So what's the right level of spending? In the presentation, you'll hear John talk about a car tyre pump that automatically shuts off when a predetermined tyre pressure has been reached, and he likens that to the MMT Job Guarantee, which is a policy to ensure that the government only spends to the point of true full employment, nothing more, nothing less, as an automatic spending control. And for more details on how that works, the job guarantee, not the tyre pump, I've linked to our episodes laying out the details. Just some quick notes before we dive in. The mainstream economics textbook on currency trading that John references is called Exchange Rates and International Finance by Lawrence Copeland. And John's own book on the topic is called Currencies, Capital Flows and Crises, a post-Keynesian analysis of exchange rate determination. And I've also linked to where you can get hold of that. Apologies for the occasional interference noises on the recording. I tried to cut out as many as possible, but some just had to stay in the edit. And just a reminder that Professor Bill Mitchell's online MMT 101 course is still running until the 12th of October. It doesn't matter if you join the course partway through. It's a part-time course. They estimate you'll need 4 hours per week to complete it. And so you'll have plenty of time to catch up. And so I've linked to where you can find out more about that in the show notes, where, as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT Podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all of our episodes and patron-only episodes. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in.
What I want to talk about today is what I have called the MMT as currency killer hypothesis. All right, this is what we hear from our detractors. And what I would really like to show you is what the priests who are holding their monopoly on knowledge, what they're not telling you, what the underlying assumptions are. And I want to arm you with the ability to, if you get stuck in an elevator with Larry Summers, first of all, just wait for the next elevator. But if you do get stuck in an elevator with him, then this is what you should say. And I have an example for you of how gloriously satisfying it is to face up to a neoclassical and know their own premises better than they do and have the person squirming about it. So we'll show you that here in just a second. Now, I don't know if you've heard, I was going to start this off with a slide of somebody making the sort of MMT as currency killer attack. And so I'm looking at all these attacks on MMT, right? And it reminded me of this, you know, the idea that the longer an internet conversation goes on, the likelihood that somebody references Nazis approaches 1. Well, I didn't find that. I didn't find anybody comparing MMT to Nazis. I probably just didn't look hard enough. But I do have one for you. This person here says, well, sure, the government can't, you know, default on the debt, but there's other ways of defaulting. Well, actually, there's not. But what this person says, if there's lots of inflation, that's kind of like defaulting. And if the currency, you know, depreciates, that's kind of like defaulting. And so that's what I want to talk about right now. I want to talk about what is the, you know, what is that argument? Where are they coming from? They're going to say, first of all, they're going to say MMT causes inflation. And then once you have the inflation, then that leads to currency depreciation. And the basic argument is, okay, let's say that some crazy MMTer gets in charge. Stephanie Kelton's sitting there by the money printing machine, turning it over and over and over. And this person creates piles of new money because government deficit spending, there's no limit to it, and so this will cause inflation. And then here's the exchange rate part. The inflation then makes domestic goods and services less attractive to foreign buyers. This means nobody wants to buy our currency. I tell my students, when you're doing research and as soon as you find a web page that says buy gold on it, just go to another page. I mean, it's just not worth it. So whether or not you can observe a thing depends on the theory you use. So if we're going to look at the MMT as currency killer view, we're going to know, well, what theory they're using. What are the foundations of this approach? They're coming up with the idea that, you know, there's going to be this catastrophic depreciation. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. The foundation of their attack starts with the equation of exchange, particularly as employed to argue that money growth leads to inflation, and then purchasing power parity. And what I'm going to argue is that's not how this works. So here is the equation of exchange, MV equals PY. And if you had an intro econ class, then you may have had to do this yourself. I used to teach it. Well, I still do, but as a means of saying it doesn't work that way. So it's so ingrained in people's minds, even without the equation being there. You know, you print money, it causes inflation, right? So that seems to be a conventional wisdom. On the right-hand side, we have the total dollar value of all transactions that took place in the economy. You know, the number of things that were produced multiplied by their average price level. On the left-hand side, you've got the money supply, and let's pretend that's just, you know, physical dollar bills. That'd be easier to think about. Physical dollar bills. How many of those there are? If this is going to be equal to the dollar value of the transactions, then we must use these dollar bills potentially more than once. For example, if there are 50 things in our economy, each one selling at an average of $6, then there's $300 worth of transactions. But oh no, we only have $100 in the money supply. How could this possibly work? Well, as long as everyone uses each dollar bill an average of 3 times, then indeed, $300 of the transactions can be financed by just 100 $1 bills. And, you know, what if we go up to 100 goods and then we have 600, but it's still only $100? Well, if the velocity is 6, that works too. And just, you know, examples like that. What the student gets out of this, I guess, is it's worth telling students that you don't need a single dollar bill for every transaction. And really, no economist disagrees with this. There was one guy, but he died. And so the equation itself is not really all that controversial. It's the assumptions about the individual variables, all right? So again, I'm trying to build up here to the MMT as currency killer in the first stage of it being MMT is going to cause inflation. Milton Friedman would say that the velocity of money is constant. It's constant because it has to do with people's habits and because it has to do with the structure of the financial institution. I mean, imagine that if it took a year for a check to clear, well then the velocity of money would be extremely low. It would be a very long time before that same dollar bill got to be spent again. So he says, well, let's just say it's constant. It's affected by long-term factors. It doesn't change very quickly. Let's just assume it's constant. And then here's a favorite assumption of neoclassical economics. Let's assume we're already at full employment. So this becomes sort of a long-run, you know, theory that in the long run, the neoclassicals are assuming that, well, we're going to get there anyway, so let's just pretend we're already there, all right? So we're going to assume then, from their perspective, that velocity and output, this is going to stay at 3, and that's going to stay at 200 because we're already at the full employment level of output, all right? Now we have our crazed MMT policymaker, and that person goes and doubles the money supply. What the hell, all right? And so what can change here? Well, V and Y can't change because our assumption is that they're constant. Our assumption is that the velocity is constant. Our assumption is that we're already at the full employment level of output, so those can't change. And we know that these two have to multiply out to the same thing, all right? So what's the only thing that can change? Oh my God, this MMT person has doubled the price level, all right? So we change the money supply, we double the money supply, and since by our monetarist assumptions, since velocity and output can't change, the only other thing we got left is the price level. So here we have, this MMT policymaker tripling the money supply because the government can't default and so on, and all they've done is tripled the price level, and that really sucks. So breaking their argument down, all right, it's based on three premises here, and another one that I have hidden that I want to bring up later that's really fun. What I want to do is I'm going to go through each of those premises and say, well, how valid is that if we compare this to real world phenomena? First one is, of course, the MV equals PY. And then I told you, velocity stable, output constant, and therefore, if we increase the money supply, all it's going to do is increase the price level. All right, first one. MV equals PY is really definitional, because the way you come up with V is you simply take P times Y and divide by M. You cannot independently calculate V. All right, you can independently calculate the money supply, kind of, and there's been whole sessions on that. You can independently figure out what the level of output is and the price level, but you can't figure out V without those other three variables, so of course it works. It would be like if you were doing research on baseball and you're like, oh my God, I have found this incredible relationship in the real world. I have all these data between batting averages and numbers of hits and at bats. Well, of course you did, because that is the definition of batting average, right? So so this is why it's like, okay, whatever, all right, that one's okay. Velocity. There's lots of evidence that velocity doesn't stay constant. Guess what? It accelerates in expansions and decelerates in recessions, and it went way down after the financial crisis and way down after COVID. But here I am quoting something from 1959. It's a very famous piece, the Radcliffe Report. We have not made more use of this concept, velocity, because we cannot find any reason for supposing or any experience in monetary history indicating there is any limit to the velocity of circulation. It's a statistical concept that tells us nothing directly about the motivation that influences the level of total demand. So, no, I don't like that premise either. Right? I don't like the velocity as constant premise either. And probably a lot of us here would be against the Y is constant part. I don't know, I just gave you a chart from 1980 of US rates of GDP growth, real GDP growth. And of course that famous quote from Keynes, that in the long run we're all dead. But not everybody knows the context of that. I mean, because specifically what he's arguing is that when we say to ourselves, well, sure, but in the long run, it goes to full employment. In the long run, we have balanced trade and so forth. He says, what we've basically done is said, you know what, I'm going to excuse myself from having to explain that at all. And by the way, all right, so I want to tell you this too, because I give talks like Rotary Club and stuff like that, and sometimes when I'm attacking mainstream economics, I think to myself, they must think I'm an idiot, that I just don't understand mainstream economics, or that I'm somehow, lying or whatever. And so I've used this quote a lot, because here is Obama's former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors in an online encyclopedia about, this entry was about business cycles. And she says here, the second sentence, the prevailing view among economists, put neoclassical in front of that, is that there is a level of economic activity often referred to as full employment at which the economy could theoretically stay forever. All right, so this is an interventionist neoclassical economist. This is Barack Obama's neoclassical economist. She's like, well, it could stay there forever unless there's an external shock. It just takes care of itself, so don't worry about it. I have a colleague who I wrote a paper on post-Keynesian economics for a neoclassical journal once. And the first thing I did was send it to other post-Keynesians. And I thought, well, that's dumb. Send it to a neoclassical, because they're the ones that are going to be reading it, and I want to know their questions. And so I sent it to a colleague, and really nice fella. In fact, he's been turned from the dark side very slowly here over the years. But he said, well, but surely the economy tends towards full employment because it's there sometimes. One of our daughters lives in Tucson, and sometimes it rains. But that doesn't mean that a lack of rain somehow causes rain, in an equilibrium sense. So, thinking back on those three premises, the MV equals PY, okay, fair enough. Velocity is constant, no, it's not. Output is, constant at the full employment level, no, it's not. But, all right, I want to talk about something else here, all right? And let's go to the master himself, Friedman. what's the name of that article? The Optimum Quantity Theory of Money, something like that. If you've heard people talk about helicopter money, but you never knew where it came from, this is where it came from. Friedman is saying here, let us suppose, he set up the model and he said, basically MV equals PY, and he said, we're at full employment, and he said velocity is constant. Everybody has as much money as they want. So he's already set all that up. And he says, now let's say a helicopter flies over and drops an additional $1,000. So that's the increase in the money supply, all right? That's the increase in M. And they already had as much money as they wanted, though, all right? So the helicopter drop created what they call an excess supply of money, all right? An excess supply of money. And because this is money they didn't want to hold on to, they rushed off to the store to buy stuff, but there is no more stuff than before because we're already at full employment. So all they did was cause inflation. So this is kind of putting a story behind MV equals PY. When the M goes up and then the P goes up, what's happening? Well, it's like a helicopter drops money out. They didn't want the cash. They went and spent the cash. There was no more stuff, and they put up the prices. The problem is that the Fed can't give people more cash than they want, all right? If this is your story, if money supply is going to be, affected by the Fed and is going to be increasing the money supply, if I'm the Fed and I want to increase the money supply, I want to buy, for example, I want to buy Treasury bills from you, right? So how can I give you more cash than you want, except that you are willing to sell me a Treasury bill, all right? You have to have there has to be a voluntary, conscious transaction. You have to be willing to sell me a Treasury bill. I cannot drop money on you. That would be wonderful. We live near the Dallas Fed, so that would be nice. But that's not the way it works. If I'm going to increase the money supply, you must believe that you want this asset in your portfolio, right? And they can't do that, all right? And I don't remember who I read this from. It might have been Basil Moore. I don't know. But it said money supply is like, money is like a haircut, all right? It cannot exist without the voluntary, conscious cooperation of another individual. So you can't have an excess supply of haircuts. If you're a barber and it's the Friday before a big holiday weekend and you're thinking, man, there's going to be a big rush, so I'll make some haircuts before people get here. That way I'll be able to, meet the rush. Now, if you're a baker, you can do that with cupcakes, all right? You can say, well, there's going to be a big rush for cupcakes, so I'll make some extra ones, and then that way when the people show up, I'll have extra cupcakes. And you can also have an excess supply of cupcakes, all right? But you can't have an excess supply of haircuts. You know who ruined that example for me? Mitt Romney. Because I don't know if you remember when he was running, he held down some unpopular kid in school and shaved his head. All right, so omitting Mitt Romney. All right, haircuts are entirely. He said he felt really bad about it. Omitting Mitt Romney, you can't do that. Now, okay, I promised you. My life has gone downhill since this next exchange I'm going to show you, because this was no offense. This was the high point of my career. This is back when on my Forbes blog I actually bothered to answer people, and I answered everybody. No, my parents were married when I was born, stuff like that. So, and this person, I had done my post on money growth leads to inflation, which now, thank you very much, Real Progressives, it's hosted there because these things on Forbes apparently expire after 10 years, right? So it's money growth doesn't cause inflation or something like that. And so a monetarist commented, a guy who had his PhD from the University of Chicago, where Friedman was, and who ran some sort of international consulting firm or something like that. And I'm going to call him Marcus the Monetarist, because his name was Marcus and he was a monetarist. And I also, I want to point, my maid Melanie and my daughter Alex was home, and I made them watch this already. And Alex said, Dad, there's misspellings in the thing you're about to show on the part of Marcus the Monetarist, and it's going to make it look like you're trying to make him look bad. It's like, I wasn't. I just copied and pasted. So forgive Marcus for the misspellings. He was in a hurry. He was also flustered, as you'll see here. But Alex has a law degree, so I thought I should take her advice and mention this real quick. And so here we go. So, and we'd already been talking about this for a few minutes. I said that, the problem is that none of that addresses the fundamental fact that one cannot increase the money supply above money demand. And look, he even uses an exclamation point here. If you cannot increase the money supply above the money demand, you would never have inflation. So, it's not, again, sometimes I think to myself, well, maybe they don't really believe this. But there it is. If you can't increase the money supply above money demand, because money is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, according to Friedman. And I said, okay, all right, fair enough. Explain how this happens in the real world. How do they increase the supply of money? And he says, well, and this is the answer. It's like putting logs in a fireplace. Look, no, it's not like putting logs in a fireplace. It's just like buying Treasury bills. It's exactly like that. And he says, well, think about a big harvest of apples. Oh, for God's sake, this should be so fundamental to a monetarist economist, what is the mechanism by which the Fed increases the money supply above money demand? And then when you think about this, why would somebody believe that? Well, all these really questionable assumptions, all I can think is that they already have this kind of bias towards government bad. And also, this didn't strike me till several years ago, because you get taught all this. I mean, I showed you that was my grad school article. I had to read Friedman. Oh my God, the helicopter's engaging in fiscal policy. It's not engaging in monetary policy. It's like a $1,200 check is what they did. It was like a $1,200 check during COVID. They dropped extra money out. If that helicopter was really doing monetary policy, it would be like in The Grinch Who Stole Christmas, when the Grinch comes into people's houses and steals all their Christmas presents, except this time they go in and steal their treasury bills, but replace them with an equivalent value of cash. And then people would wake up in the morning and say, crap, this is not the portfolio of assets I wanted. Now I've got more cash than I wanted. But do they go to Target to buy a big screen TV? No, they go back to the financial market. So this is going to be a financial market adjustment. So for that matter, the helicopter is engaging in fiscal and not monetary policy. All right. Well, let's do something now that they don't do for us. Let's be charitable. Let's say, yeah, but all right, your monetary policy mechanism is all screwed up, but fiscal policy can cause inflation. And that's what we're talking about, it's fiscal policy, so that could cause inflation. It's not the printing of the money. If we're already at full employment, World War II, U.S. is at less than 2% unemployment, and we're still stimulating the economy. This is why we raised taxes, why we had bond drives, and why we had wage and price control. So, hey, monetarists and neoclassicals, stop doing the MV equals PY thing. Let me do you a favor, all right? Let me tell you, you should be talking about fiscal policy and not monetary policy. That could potentially cause inflation. Except the whole idea behind what we're talking about is, what if there was a gas station where you could get free air for your tires? In fact, there is near our house. And near that gas station, we always see tons of cars stranded in the parking lot because people just kept putting in air until their tires exploded. No, of course not. Just because there was no limit to how much air they could get for free didn't mean like, oh my God, this is awesome, and then the tire explodes. There's a different goal now. You look on the inside of your car door and it says 32 pounds per square inch, and you're like, okay, and I'm watching the thing back here as I put the air in. I don't keep on going just because it's free. In fact, there's a place where it's not free near us where you can actually plug in 32 and go over and it just turns itself off. That's a job program, all right? That turns itself off. So, yeah, you're right. If you continue to stimulate the macroeconomy past full employment, but remember they're already assuming full employment, so any stimulation, I guess, is past full employment, then that would be inflationary, and that's why we don't do it, all right? There's part one of the foundation. There's the equation of exchange, which I spent a long time on, but eventually decided to be charitable and say, oh, you don't have to think about equation of exchange anymore, neoclassicals. We'll let you slide with fiscal policy can cause inflation. Okay, yeah, it can, but that's why we've already thought about that. Right? Now, and my area is actually exchange rates. And so the second part of the argument is, right, the first part is that MMT policies will cause inflation. And the second part is that inflation will then cause currency depreciation. All right, let's say there's inflation from, let's grant the first part. Well, I've already said I don't think that makes sense, but let's grant the first part there's inflation. Does inflation necessarily cause the currency to depreciate? The specific theory that they're using here is purchasing power parity. I mean, if you've heard of the Big Mac Index in The Economist, that's what it's based on. What they're doing is they're looking at what is the price of a Big Mac in London versus the price of a Big Mac in New York once you take into account exchange rate differences. And if it's still more expensive in London, once you measure them both in the same currency, oh, well, then the pound is overvalued. All right, and so we should expect the pound to depreciate. All right, now, I was lazy and used the same slides I did for an Australian MMT presentation I did, so that's why we have Brisbane and Melbourne. But I'm going to start off with just purely domestic stuff to explain where neoclassicals are coming from with inflation causes currency depreciation. And let's say that you find out that a loaf of bread in Brisbane is $3, $3 Australian dollars, and in Melbourne it's $4. Let's assume no transportation costs because it is an 18-hour drive from Melbourne to Brisbane, but no transportation costs. What are you going to do? You're going to buy up the bread in Brisbane and then drive down to Melbourne and set up a little briefcase or whatever on the corner and start selling bread. And it's going to drive up the bread price in Brisbane and drive it down in Melbourne until voila, the arbitrage opportunity is gone. But now and it's the same basic idea, except now let's do Brisbane and Shanghai, all right? And let's say that we find out that a loaf of bread in Brisbane is $3 Australian dollars and 12 yuan in Shanghai? Oh, well, obviously we have a piece of information missing. And so let's say that for every 1 Australian dollar, you can get 5 yuan. And now let's translate them both into dollars, Australian dollars. Aha! In Shanghai, bread's actually cheaper. Or we can do it, of course, in yuan. Either way, the bread in Shanghai is cheaper than it is in Brisbane. So now we got the same situation, except we have to go across an ocean as well. And this sets into motion people buying up the bread in Shanghai and then selling it in Brisbane. Now, this is bad for Australia, right? I mean, what if this is, that's really the law of one price. It's not purchasing power parity. Law of one price is like every good should be exactly the same. Purchasing power parity is on average, they should all be the same. So let's say that that's representative of other prices in Australia and China. Then, oh no, they have a trade deficit. Now this is another place where, you know, like the full employment assumption, that if we have something threatening the economy, well, that's okay, the economy fixes itself. Well, this is going to fix itself, all right? This is going to fix itself now. This is glorious how the free market works. Australia has a trade deficit. This could potentially be draining demand from the Australian economy, but that's okay. Because what's going to happen is everyone's going to be buying the yuan in order to buy their bread, and no one's going to be buying the Australian dollar. So the Australian dollar will depreciate. Look at what it was before. You got 5 for 1 Australian dollar before. Now you can only get 4. So the yuan appreciated, the Australian dollar depreciated. I could, of course, change the own prices of bread, but I left those alone because this is a story about exchange rates. But it is possible that, you know, the neoclassicals would say, well, maybe these will change some too. But I want someone to talk about exchange rates here. And so now once they're both translated in the same currency, then we have the exact same price, and Australia has a trade balance, and the free market has fixed everything, all right? So the trade deficits go away just like unemployment goes away by itself. Now, so linking this back into the MMT as currency killer thing, what does that say? Well, they're going to say that MMT is going to cause the domestic price of bread, for example, to go up, and then no one's going to want to buy the dollar, because the exchange rate is driven entirely in this theory by the purchases of currency to buy bread, you know, to buy goods and services, all right? The exchange rate is driven entirely by the relative prices of goods and services in each country. So here's a country here and one over here. Y'all's bread prices are really high and yours aren't, so your currency depreciates. All right, so you have an MMT policymaker. Oh no, she's caused terrible inflation, and so bread's really expensive, and so nobody wants to buy this, you know, your currency, and so your currency collapses. Right. So let's see how well this theory holds up. And I teach a class on exchange rates, and back before I had done a lot of my own research on it, I didn't have anything else to teach. I was teaching all neoclassical stuff. And this person's textbook is really good. To use neoclassical jargon, it's rigorous, which means there's lots of math and graphs. And one of the first things that would strike you, okay, I want you to think about if you were taking this class, you've paid, let's say $10,000. You've paid $10,000, you're like, oh, wow, I can't wait to learn this. If you were like I was as an undergrad, you're thinking, I'm going to be a rich currency trader. That's what I'm going to do. So I can't wait to learn this single individual theory that must exist about the largest market on the planet. And the first thing you notice in the table of contents is, oh my God, there's 7 theories in here, right? There isn't one theory about the single largest market on the planet that never closes. There's 7 in there. And at the end of every chapter, and this is why I love the book so much, even though I don't agree with it. I love the book so much because at the end of every chapter, he stops and says, well, let's see, how did that one work? All right, let's see how that one worked. And this is what he has in the section on purchasing power parity. We can summarize the evidence by saying that on the face of it, there appears to be no obvious tendency towards purchasing power parity. Well, that sucks, because I just spent a lot of time studying for this exam and thought this was going to be useful. But wait, there's more. We have seen that there are persuasive reasons for supposing that it ought to work. Doggone it, the theory makes sense, you know. But there's, you know, however, the facts, doggone the facts, would appear to provide little support in the short run, and evidence in the long run is at best mildly supportive, all right? So this is from, and obviously we could get criticisms from people who aren't neoclassicals. This is a neoclassical textbook, all right? And he's surveying the right literature. I mean, that is what the literature says in that area. Also, here's another neoclassical paper. What they did was they surveyed currency dealers, all right? And they discovered that 63% of currency dealers felt that purchasing power parity is merely academic jargon, all right? And even more damning than that, they had a little question in there. Okay, what if you found out that, based on purchasing power parity, that the dollar was overvalued? Would you sell dollars? Yeah, about 1 in 10 of them would. But otherwise, they're like, no, this means nothing. All right, so they're the ones carrying out the transaction. So you think, I'm sympathetic to what the neoclassicals say about surveys, that people don't always do what they say. Okay, but we're supposed to be scientists and figure out the difference and figure out, and what your justification for your actions is nevertheless interesting. I don't know if you know this or not, but in exchange rate literature, there was a period in the late 80s and through the 90s where there were lots and lots of surveys that they would use, surveys of, if you're a room full of currency dealers, where do you think the euro is going to go a week from now? Where do you think it's going to go a month from now? They would use those data to test various theories. But there would always be an apology in the article. Yeah, I know we don't really use surveys, but I didn't have any choice. All right, so please don't get on me for that, because other disciplines are heavily survey dependent, but neoclassicism is skeptical to the point of we're just not going to look. Have you seen the one, if economists were asked to explain the behavior of horses, they wouldn't go and look at horses. They would sit in their offices and think to themselves, what would I do if I were a horse? And this was from a neoclassical economist. It's like, the sort of basic idea of where do I get my premises? Introspection. Think about, well, let's see, if I was an entrepreneur, what would I do? I had a really nice colleague once who was presenting, not that she's no longer nice, she's just no longer a colleague, that she was presenting a paper on how do high schools decide to have AP classes, advanced placement classes. And she had a regression analysis, and it was very interesting. And I said, how many administrators did you ask? And she was like, I never thought about that. And she honestly just never thought about the fact that maybe it would be a good idea to actually talk to a superintendent who made this decision. Because what they say and what they do isn't worthwhile. And then that's why we don't bother to look at horses. We just sit in our offices and pretend we're one. Well, I want to show you one more thing from this book, okay? And it's my absolute both favorite and least favorite thing. This is after he's gone over 5 different exchange rate theories. And at the end of every one saying, yeah, that one didn't work. Yeah, that one didn't work. And I cannot begin to imagine putting this next sentence into a book that students have now spent all this mental energy and physical energy studying. At the end of the next chapter, he says, when it says, how did this theory work? Well, to travel hopefully, it is said, is better than to arrive. This one doesn't work either. It has been in there since this is the 5th edition. It's been in there since the 1st edition, that sentence. And so I've quoted the hell out of it. Sometimes when I quote the hell out of something, that economist takes that out. All right, so there was an econ department somewhere on the West Coast that said, you might be surprised what it takes to go to graduate school, why doing well in economics is not necessarily helpful. And so I quoted that a lot and stuff, and they took it out. So that was that. And then I used to quote this fellow Hans Visser quite a bit, and this was in the early days of the internet. I went into my office, I checked my computer, and there's an email from an H. Visser, and I thought, oh my God. So I didn't even check it. I went and taught my classes and worked up my courage to see what Hans Visser was going to yell at me. Yeah, it turns out he's a nice guy. But he had said something about, and this will actually come up here in a minute, that, well, it could be that exchange rates are driven by things like capital flows and animal spirits, but then we're left with Keynes's gloomy view. Not that it doesn't seem to work, but I don't want to think that. And so what he emailed to me was, well, if I'm a neoclassical, I'm a reluctant one. Okay, but you still are one, huh? So that was an interesting experience. So if purchasing power parity doesn't work, by their own admission, then what should we be doing instead? So here is the actual volume of trade according to the World Trade Organization. In 2019, there were $18.9 trillion worth of imports/exports. So if the currency market really is mostly driven by this, like purchasing power parity says, then when I put this next number down here, it should be reasonably close to 18.9. If the market for foreign currency is really just derivative of the market for foreign goods and services, and this is the market for foreign goods and services, then this next number should be reasonably close to 18.9, right? And now, to be fair, there are going to be covering transactions when a bank, undertakes a transaction to finance somebody's imports or exports, and it's not really very close at all. So there's the actual volume of currency trade. That turns out to be 2.1% of all currency activity is the same size as world trade. And what I was going to say was, to be fair, there may be covering transactions. There may be several transactions related to a single, transaction to finance imports. Let's say there's 10. That's ridiculous. Let's say there's 10. We're still left at 11%. 11% of the market is all we have explained with trade flows. So no wonder purchasing power parity doesn't work. It's ignoring 89% at best. 89% of the market, and probably closer to 98.9. So what should we do instead, all right? Maybe we should look at those capital flows. If we're trying to explain exchange rates, maybe we look at the capital flows instead. So if we're going to look at financial flows as being what drives exchange rates, and what I'm trying to point out here is, it's not like there's not an alternative to purchasing power parity. There's other things we can do to explain currency prices that are based on what the activity actually represents. Perhaps we'll look into psychology. This is common in Tversky stuff with availability and representatives and anchoring, that behavioral finance stuff. We talk about if you're a room full of currency dealers and you're thinking about buying or selling the euro, you're basing this on a forecast, right? You're trying to decide which way do I think it's going to go. That is your overriding goal, is to figure out which way do you think it's going to go. And so we have to figure out what's the nature of these expectations, what affects them. And Keynes has some really good things to say in the general theory about things that affect people's forecasts and expectations, sort of the characteristics of them, to where we create a world here where things like panic and euphoria can happen in a way they can't happen in a typical neoclassical model, because so many people have all the information and so forth. So they sort of have a psychology background. And then we can do things like this. And again, my point being, it's not like we don't have an alternative. This is supposed to be like, okay, what does the brain of a currency dealer look like? Here's your forecast right here. Here's all the various things that they'll be looking at on their computer screen to just try to feed into, figure out which way it's going to go, and then how that leads to various things in technical analysis, signals, and so on. We have an alternative, all right? We can then take exchange. This is from Anina Kaltenbrunner at Leeds University. She's done some really interesting stuff with a Minskian currency hierarchical approach to international exchange rates. And so, we get in trouble for you don't have any models. Well, here's one. What the hell? I mean, this is a model of the domestic macroeconomy. It's got Keynes's ZD diagram and the impact of the exchange rate, balance of trade, and so forth. So it's not like we don't have an alternative to purchasing power parity that they say themselves doesn't work. And so you can build a post-Keynesian view of exchange rates that explains all these things that the neoclassical stuff doesn't. All right. So currency markets are driven by financial flows. Financial investors seek higher rates of return. Where would you expect higher rates of return to be? Are we going to expect an MMT Job Guarantee country to be a place I don't want to invest? Or is it actually going to be a place where, the economy is doing really well there, right? And unemployment's low, presumably GDP growth is high. And so the idea that MMT and a job guarantee would cause a currency to collapse, it might cause it to go up, which is not necessarily a goal, because it makes it more difficult for you to export. But there's no clear indication that, as soon as we adopt these policies, then the currency will collapse. In fact, it might do the opposite if these policies do what we know they will do. So in summary, what was the case against MMT? It causes huge increases in the money supply because adherents believe there are no consequences to this, just like those people at the gas station with all their tires blown out. These increases in the money supply cause inflation, and the inflation means that nobody can buy our stuff, therefore nobody buys our currency. But I object, because in fact, money growth doesn't cause inflation, right? And even if we grant that, fiscal policy can, but I don't know if you know any of these people here, but they've already thought about this, and they've said, but when the economy is already at full employment, we don't continue to do that, all right? So the idea that everyone's down at the neoclassicals got everybody down at the gas station filling up their tires until they explode, whereas in fact, what we're doing is we're going to the gas station where you punch in 32 pounds per square inch, and it doesn't cause terrible inflation, right? And on top of that, currency prices are driven by financial transactions, not trade flows. And the full employment policies of MMT are more likely to create a domestic currency appreciation than a depreciation. Now, people that aren't formally trained in this might think to themselves, surely neoclassicals don't believe this stuff, all right? And you may have heard of Paul Romer's paper that came out. He later won the Nobel Prize. Let me tell you about that for a second. So he writes this article attacking neoclassical economics. He's a neoclassical macro, and for reasons that I don't agree with, but I do agree that there are, or let's put it this way, his idea of what we should substitute instead isn't what I would agree with, but nevertheless, and he says we've reached an era of post-real macroeconomics where the modelers don't care if it has any connection whatsoever to the real world anymore, and this is one of theirs. Now, I was on a panel with him after this came out, but before he got the Nobel Prize. I like to think I put him over the top. And I was asking him about it, and he said, oh, I caught hell for this, for writing this. You know why he got in trouble? Nobody said you're wrong. They said, how dare you? How dare you say these things about our revered thinkers? How dare you say something about Milton Friedman? Yeah, even by our own admission, this stuff doesn't make sense, but nevertheless. Now, have you heard of a book by it's Colander and Clomer, I think, from like 1990, something like that. They went and they studied PhD econ programs at the supposedly top institutions. These PhD students from Harvard, MIT, Chicago, when they said to them, what do you think is most important in terms of succeeding as an economist, they put a thorough knowledge of the economy at the bottom, right? And the thing is, it's not wrong. I mean, in my PhD level international trade theory class, highest grade in the class, very proud of myself, all right? And it was all matrix algebra. And I was standing in line at the grocery store not long afterwards. And it suddenly struck me, my God, if everyone else in line here knew I just finished a PhD level course in trade, I wouldn't be able to answer a single question they would logically have. Who's our biggest trading partner? It's either A or B, because those are the only two countries he ever used. What do we import? Either X or Y. That one's easy. Why is our, the industrial heartland, why is it, collapsing? I have no idea. I have no earthly idea. Math is like I like math. I was a physics major to start with. But math for math's sake is like the dark side of the force. It is fun. And it makes you feel better than other people. Ha-ha, you can't figure this out. But it's not the way to do economics. Anyway, merci bien.
So we're now going to hear the question and answer section of Professor Harvey's presentation. And the questions weren't very clear on the recording, so I'll give you my interpretation of each question. Apologies if I've misinterpreted any. This first one, as I understand it, is you say that monetary policy doesn't cause inflation and therefore doesn't influence the exchange rate. But you also say that the main determinant of exchange rates is capital flows. And so you could argue that monetary policy does influence capital flows. Here's John's answer.
As a matter of fact, you're exactly right. Yes, that's in the brain of the currency market, dealer. That indeed, monetary policy can have an effect on my view of whether or not the dollar is a good investment. But the idea that the transmission mechanism is through goods and services is what I'm saying is not true. One of the sort of the biggest determinants of currency prices and interest rates are number one. Not like, oh, that's 90% of it, but they're sort of the most common. What did Russians do to boost the ruble days after the invasion? They changed the interest rate from 10 to 20%, and guess what? That worked really well. Because maybe I will take a chance and not cash in my rubles because I'm making 20%. So it's a very powerful mechanism, and that's affected by monetary policy. But it's a different line of causation. What we do in class is I go through like periods of history in the United States and sort of the history of the dollar. And only in the first period, which is after the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, the currency dealers pay any attention whatsoever to trade flows. They just really didn't care. But they do pay attention to monetary policy, but really more in terms of what the rate of return would be. This doesn't mean that trade flows are irrelevant, but it means that the mechanism by which the trade flows end up impacting the exchange rates really through the financial sector.
Now, I couldn't make out this next question, but it seems to be prompting John to consider that developing economies have different concerns regarding trade and capital flows to developed economies, and also that people with power and political influence in developing economies will fight back against progressive policies like, say, the MMT Job Guarantee and capital controls. And so, is there a strategy for dealing with that?
I've heard my students joke to each other before that if you don't know what else to say on the test, say capital flows. And that's pretty close. And so what we end up with at the end is, Do we need these people, the owners of capital, to be searching around the world for a higher rate of return? Is this helpful? Mexico didn't think so in 1994 when all of a sudden the money's come flying out. But a cornerstone, I think, it has to be capital controls. I don't think it will. Now, strategy, I don't think it will ever happen because the people who are in power gain from this. All right, so I don't know how we do this. One of my colleagues, his daughter said to him, well, we just need you to die. In terms of his generation, not him in particular, because he's a good guy, but his generation, in order to find somebody to fight against this, because these hot money flows are not at all useful. And what individual developing countries need to do are things like capital controls and differential exchange rates. And of course, that discourages money from coming in. But then you have to decide that's okay, because it also discourages it from flying out overnight as well. So I don't know how we make it happen, but what can we do?
This next comment was from Patricia, and she brings up the idea that when people advance the argument that a country that implements MMT policies will weaken their exchange rate and therefore push up inflation, what they're really saying is that they think there's a strong link between exchange rates and inflation. But when Britain left the EU, for instance, the currency depreciated quite quickly by 20%. But in her recollection, inflation didn't go up by 20%.
No, that's right. And you read this, they will literally say, well, actually, currency prices are much more volatile than the fundamentals, quote unquote, whatever they may be, which, by the way, I have a paper on that from like 20 years ago where I went through all these neoclassical articles. So what did they mean by the fundamentals? And they meant different things by the and yet you would think the very word fundamental would imply that these are sort of a solid set of ideas that we all share, and they weren't. But anyway, even by their own admission, even when they don't really define the fundamentals, they say, yeah, there's a lot more volatility. But what do we do when we can't explain the short run? We just look at the long run. We just say, okay, well, it's a long run phenomenon. So, but yeah, they know this. And yes, you had a question in the back, and I'll come back.
Now, at this point, there were some questions that I've left out of the edit, which prompted John to emphasize that his book on exchange rates only deals with developed economies at this point, and that the next edition of the book would look at the implications for developing economies. But a general theme seems to be that exchange rate volatility negatively impacts developing economies more than developed ones. And I think John's perspective is that the only remedy for this is capital controls, policies that make it harder for investors to rapidly pull investment out of a nation's economy, and that those controls would make that economy less attractive to a certain type of investor. So countries in this position will probably have to make a tough choice between imposing capital controls and perhaps losing out on some level of foreign investment as a consequence, or continuing to suffer economic shocks resulting from exchange rate volatility. Now, that's just my overview taken from this talk and reading between the lines of all our other interviews we've done with John, which I've linked to in our show notes. Another insight from John's work is that capital flows or financial flows are a much bigger factor than trade flows or flows of real goods and services when it comes to determining exchange rates. But the next commenter asks John to consider that perhaps the impacts are different in the long run as opposed to the short run, and that for developing economies, trade flows could be the more important factor in the long run.
Right. Certainly policy-wise. Yeah. But I guess the difference is that the trade is important in the long run policy-wise, but when we're setting up our model, that doesn't mean we ignore everything but the trade flows in trying to explain the exchange rates.
This next question is paraphrasing. Do you think there is a hierarchy of currencies? And if so, do you think this will always be the case? Or is it possible for every nation to have a strong and stable currency?
Well, there definitely is a hierarchy of currencies as exists right now. No question that, geez, I have some money to put into savings, so I want to use dollars or pesos, I'm going to use the dollars. And so that forces Mexico to do certain things to attract the hard currency that they don't want to do otherwise in terms of not having capital controls and having higher interest rates. My gut feeling is that ultimately there's going to develop a hierarchy of currencies, in some sense. There's going to be, when at the end of the day you have to ask yourself, I have this international portfolio of assets, and what currency do I want to put it in? If you're going to ask that question, there's going to be a hierarchy, I would think.
Finally, this last question was, again paraphrasing, given how innovative the financial sector is at bypassing and gaming regulation, does John think that capital controls will be enough to safeguard developing economies from the negative impacts of capital inflows and outflows?
Not static ones, because that's what I've seen, because I was trained as a neoclassical, like almost everybody is, but then I found the post-Keynesian stuff. I was like, oh my God, now I do want to finish my PhD. And from the beginning, with Minsky on up, it's like, no, they're always going to innovate. They're always going to find ways to go around. So it must be active and discretionary. You must be able to make changes sort of on the move. So otherwise, you're absolutely right. They'll figure out a way around it because that they have every reason to. So, but I don't know. It depends on the circumstances, of course. Eileen Grable talks about having speed bumps and tripwires to indicate that there are problems evolving. For example, one of the tripwires would be, what is the ratio in this country of loans taken out in foreign currency versus domestic currency? As that goes up, this economy is more unstable. It's more likely to have if there's a currency collapse, and short-term versus long-term loans and so forth. So if you have things like that, and then the speed bumps are to slow down, the capital outflow. And I think if you have things like that in place, then maybe you can do enough of the discretionary stuff to say, oh my God, there's a problem. Clearly we haven't fixed all this like we thought we had. But you're absolutely right that you have to continue to do it. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.